But no more worries, rest your head and go to sleep. Maybe one day we'll wake up and this will all just be a dream. By Abstract Psychopomp. Check the trigger warnings in the description. Summary. His hands were calloused, the fingers rough and the skin like armor, and he felt where a few hours earlier he'd cut his index finger rolling down the mountain. The cut covered with a thin but strong gauze that Tomioka himself had wrapped around the flushed finger, a rare worry stirring in his chest as he warned the boy to be more careful, who had looked at him in surprise, his eyes watering as he remembered how his father had done the same for him when he was barely 6, as he remembered the way he himself had done the same with Rokota on an afternoon when the boy had felt so energetic. Or the path of feeling again, Giyuu finding himself as a parental figure for 2 traumatized children. Giyuu sank to his knees in the snow and stood motionless, hands clasped in prayer, thinking back to the few words his sister, foresighted as she was, unaware of how they would serve him too soon and too often, had taught him to recite in familiar situations, even if Sotako had never prepared him to bury an entire family devoured by a demon because of him. Or, at least, she would have never thought that his brother would have found himself in a similar situation. He had taken the shovel positioned behind the house, and had hurriedly dug 5 holes, and had almost felt sick at the size of most of them. The boy and the demon were asleep, and Giyuu had reassured them with calm words about the burial of their siblings and mother, convincing the stubborn child that he couldn't help him in such a state, and that he wouldn't have let him either. Then he had returned to the house, walked into the lake of blood and avoided hitting those bodies too small to be in that condition, and had started with the youngest, pink eyes open and glassy, neck split open, bones visible and destroyed in a grotesque spectacle. He squeezed him tightly, ignoring the blood that now stained Sabito's yukata. Much how he hated to see that color cover the symmetrical pattern again and again. And he gently closed his eyes, exiting and leaving only silence behind. The first corpse hit the ground that was quickly being covered in snow, and Giyuu returned. The mother, her neck too close to her chest to be natural, stood with her arm outstretched towards where the corpse had been, found shortly before, and that now was covered by a soft snow, surrounded by roots and dust, because there was no clean fabrics in which to wrap the dead bodies, and Giyuu wouldn't do it with blood-soaked ones. Where the hand should have met the rest of the limb, the skin had been pulled away, and something at this point, had planted its teeth where the severed artery still leaked warm blood, butchering even more of the stump that now lay on the woman's outstretched legs. He lifted her head, and also closed those gaping eyelids, one last cry of pain immortalized by eternity, and pulled her towards him, keeping her head within her hand, because without the support it probably would have detached from the rest of her neck. Another full hole, and 3 children were missing. The little girl was huddled against the wall, simply thrown against it with the back of her hair and pale blue yukata soaked in blood, coming from where the strong wood had struck the still, frail bone of the skull, the joints no longer fixed in a gruesome spectacle that was open to the world, but that ensured their death was quick and immediate. The second, outside and half covered by the snow, was lying on his stomach with half of his face probably destroyed by a blow that had thrown him away. The other, like the mother, had been mutilated but of the entire leg, which had probably been ingested in too little time to give the child time to accomplish anything. The fingernails were destroyed and pulled back in, some missing as well, like the entire little finger of the right hand. And Giyuu realized that he had probably tried to grab the marble skin of the monster, that had limited himself to almost slice it in 2 with sufficiency. The other wounds were missing, and Giyuu stayed longer with that child, who had suffered more than the others, a painful and slow death, in which he had the time to understand what was happening despite everything, time to be torn apart by the pain. Bodies littered the holes, and evening was approaching. The sky pink and the light reflected off the snow in a sight he might have been able to appreciate, had he not had 4 open graves before him and 2 children to care for. And whose fault was that? He forced himself to take the last action, to cover them up and give them at least some peace, before they woke up. He didn't allow himself to rest, even though he hadn't slept more than an hour for a week to recover a minimum of strength, going on only thanks to his breathing technique, and every square inch of his body now begged for mercy. He probably should have stayed like this for another week, just to punish himself after he was indirectly responsible for the deaths of an entire family. But it would have made it impossible for him to save more, and if he was going to live, he wanted to at least do something good. He forced himself to clean the inside of the house, free it from the blood that was beginning to dry, to at least give the siblings a distant image of normality. The eldest, still human, held his sister close to him, his chest where she was leaning, rising and falling regularly. In the last light of sunset, traces of tears shone on his face, and he clutched the rumpled kimono of the demon with an impressive grip. The demon continued to sleep, but not reached by the sun thanks to the only clean tire Giyuu could find, which he had wrapped all around her completely, her black hair kept hidden as well as her face covered by the bamboo muzzle. They had fallen asleep against the outer wall of the house, or at least Giyuu had left them there, and they had continued to sleep undisturbed by the hell that would have awaited them. He let himself go on to the now completely clean table, pulling out one of the sheets he always carried with him on a mission, hurrying to write. "Boy, you will suffer for your choice, and your sister will be well received by no one, as well as you if you decide to continue on this path. Hunting those beings who destroyed your family could give you purpose and more chance to find a way to make your sister human again. Under no circumstances should she expose herself to sunlight, since it's deadly to demons. Never take off her bamboo muzzle, and always try to keep the most human part of her afloat. I believe in you, and I wish you all the luck in the world. Go in search of Sakonji Orokodaki on Mount Sagiri. Find him, and tell him that the water pillar, Giyuu Tomioka, sent you to be trained, that he has decided to spare your sister, but rest assured because I will personally send him a letter. Try to hold on, and use that strength of yours to improve this world, and don't let anyone else suffer what you're suffering." The last few words he wrote to his old master were hasty and precise, asking for understanding and trust in his old student's judgment, as if he had ever given a reason to deserve such trust, to spare the girl from death and her brother from an enormous suffering. He didn't expect much from the future, but if he could avoid at least a little pain, he would have tried. And the boy was strong and willing. Had he endured Orokodaki's training, he could have become his Sugoku, after years spent looking for an apprentice to take on the role of water pillar when the time came. Giyuu had planned everything since he was named water pillar. He would have found a Sugoku. He would have personally trained him, taught him everything he had learned in that decade, including the 11th form he had perfected for years, and come the moment he would have spent his last months of life hunting even more powerful demons. He would have even tried an upper moon at this point. If he won, one less burden on the world. If he lost, no one would have worried too much, and his Sugoku would have taken his place. And he couldn't help but hope that the boy would succeed in his enterprise, that the role of water pillar would again be taken by someone deserving of the honors he carried, and that he would finally be allowed to rest. Giyuu left the same evening, returning to the water estate to rest for a few hours and heal some few wounds left from that last mission, the one that preceded the massacre of the family on the mountain, which ended with only one wounded and no dead, if not the demon itself. After that night, he didn't hear anything from the boy until 6 months later, and he wasn't expecting to get a letter in the middle of a pillar meeting for sure. "Giyuu Tomioka! Giyuu Tomioka! Letter from Mount Sagiri! Urgent letter from Mount Sagiri!" And even though the head of the house really wasn't speaking at the time, everyone glared at the old crow, and almost surprised at how quickly Tomioka took the letter that was tied to his claw. "Oyakata-sama, I apologize for the failure to educate my Kasugai crow, but I request to read the letter immediately," again apologizing for the interruption. Shinasugawa refrained from yelling at him in annoyance, but Ubuyashiki just smiled at him. "If your old master writes to you so urgently, you must hurry up and read, my child. Don't worry. I will continue meditating for another few minutes. My dear daughter, bring me a cup of tea if you could be so kind." The other Hashiras remained silent while the water pillar read the words written on the good paper. At first he looked confused, uncertainly vivid in his face. Then he seemed struck by a sudden realization, and he squeezed the hands that held the letter, rubbing the light edges. He concluded the reading, making a face that no one would have called a smile, but it was perhaps the most varied expression they had ever seen him make. So, no, it wasn't a "your master is dead" emergency. Maybe something good. Not that Shinasugawa could think of anything that would make oh-so-awesome Tomioka Giyuu happy. "Kanazaburo. Take her back to my estate, please." The scruffy old raven left, and Tomioka seemed to act like nothing happened, and Kocho tilted her head curiously, still scrutinizing him. "Good news from your master's new student, Giyuu." And as always, the man knew more than the devil. "Yes, Oyakata-sama." "When do you plan to visit them?" "As soon as I can." "It's brave of you." He hurriedly bowed his head. "Oyakata-sama." And beyond that confused exchange, no one else said anything, and the meeting resumed. Back in his estate, after dodging Kocho's questions, he took the time to answer the letter. "Tomioka Giyuu. My name is Tanjiro Kamado, and my sister is Nezuko Kamado. You saved us about 6 months ago, after a demon killed our entire family and turned Nezuko into a demon herself. You spared her for her control, and I write to you from Mount Sagiri, where I have been training with Orokodaki Sukonji for 5 months. I wrote to thank you, over and over again, for what you did for me and my family that day. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for you, and my sister would have been killed by a demon hunter like yourself, and maybe lost control of her without me. The merit belongs to you, and we thank you. Nezuko has been sleeping since we started traveling, not waking up for all these months. For Orokodaki-san, it's due to her not feeding and trying to maintain energy, but I still worry. The training is hell, and according to him, you're an old student of him. Was it so terrible, even for you, or am I so unaccustomed to such exercises? Well, if throwing myself down a waterfall can be called an exercise. But I trust Orokodaki-san as my teacher. I'm still a little worried. I'm looking forward to learning water breathing, and he told me you are the water Hashira. You must be really powerful. Stop by and visit if you find the time. I'll be happy to see you again, and thank you decently. With all my respect, Kamado Tanjiro." The boy was grateful to him, sure, but he himself had recognized his power as Hashira, so how could he be so kind when he hadn't been able to save his family? Maybe he didn't really understand the whole situation. And Giyuu did not go to Mount Sagiri, not immediately, but waited. And when, after 3 months, he decided to reach the house of his old master, he was welcomed by the elderly demon hunter. "Giyuu, we haven't seen each other for years." And it was true, because since Sabito had died, Giyuu had never been able to look the man in his eyes, not when he was responsible for the death of one of his best and most valiant students. "Is the boy okay?" he opted to ask, entering the house when Orokodaki moved to let him pass through the door. "He's training, but I'm sure he told you everything by letter. Why now, my child?" And the affectionate appellation almost made him recoil, his heart heavy as he recalled the best years of his life, the days spent with the other boys, and the evenings in front of the fire, the skillful hands of his master in his hair, braiding them as he used to, himself years ago, because he didn't deserve such affection, not anymore. "I want to meet him, and talk to him." Orokodaki nodded, more than familiar with the few words Giyuu used to say, even the most complex of things. As sunset neared, Orokodaki cooked dinner, and footsteps became audible outside the window. "Orokodaki-san, the boy from almost a year ago looked at him. His eyes lit up with realization, and he moved forward in a second, kneeling on the tatami, his hands on his legs and his forehead almost touching the floor. And Giyuu panicked. "Tomioka Giyuu-sama, thank you from me and my sister, Nezuko, for sparing her and saving me an unpleasant death or an incomplete future without her, without a purpose. Thank you for what you did for us, and thank you again." Orokodaki had stopped, and was now looking with hard but sympathetic eyes at the still kneeling boy. "Saving you was my job as a demonslayer, Kamado Tanjiro, and the possibility of demons not loyal to Muzan and capable of working with us was too precious to throw away. Get up and eat. He didn't know exactly what to say to Kamado Tanjiro. He had confined himself to a few words, a tone of voice as flat and peaceful as his breathing style. But the boy had brightened, smiled, and stood up to address a few words to a now satisfied Orokodaki. Giyuu paid them no particular attention, still thinking about the boy. Now he was speaking in a ringing voice to his master, their master at this point, though Tanjiro would have better put into practice that precious knowledge the man would give him. Hair reaching his shoulders and eyes sparkling despite the visible tiredness. Standing up, he noticed the way his knees were shaking, and he veered to the right slightly to ignore it and sit down at the table, continuing to argue with Orokodaki. "Tomioka-san, will you be staying here for long?" He recovered to answer him, still flat and monotonous. "Only a few days. I will leave for a mission on April 18th. The boy seemed to go limp like a paper lantern hit by a rock and nodded almost despondently, and Giyuu glanced at the older man with a confused expression on his face. "But Giyuu-kun will come back when he gets the chance, right?" It didn't sound like a question to him. "Tomorrow he'll help you with your training, so don't be pathetic." But Giyuu knew that the boy could never look pathetic to him. But he watched him practice, without putting pressure or anxiety breathing down his neck and judging him on everything, considering every mistake was immediately followed by a new attempt, and finally a success. And the boy kept smiling at him, and Giyuu wondered how he could do that. "Thank you for burying my siblings and my mother, Tomioka-san. It was more than kind, and I can never thank you enough." He spoke too gratefully, too sadly, his eyes shining too full of acceptance and joy and sadness. "They wouldn't have died if I had arrived faster." And Giyuu didn't want to say that, because until now the boy hadn't understood it, perhaps, and now the kind words that were rarely addressed to him would have ceased. But maybe it was better that way, rather than living a lie. Eyes wide open, his hands suddenly between those decidedly smaller of the 14-year-old. "Tomioka-san, the fault lies solely with the demon who attacked us. And the fact that you feel guilty underscores even more that you're not. You've done so much for us, and my gratitude won't be swept away by some silly, unwarranted, and meaningless revenge." His hands were calloused, the fingertips rough in the skin like armor, and he felt where a few hours earlier he'd cut his index finger rolling down the mountain, the cut covered with a thin but strong gauze that Tomioka himself had wrapped around the flushed finger, a rare worry stirring in his chest as he warned the boy to be more careful. Who had looked at him in surprise, his eyes watering as he remembered how his father had done the same for him when he was barely 6, as he remembered the way he himself had done the same with Rokuta on an afternoon when the boy had felt so energetic. "If you feel so guilty, visit us more often. Your company makes us all very happy." That kind smile, and Giyuu decided that he would not only make this boy his Sagoku, but train him to Hashira level. Because someone capable of smiling at someone like him so genuinely would have never deserved to die. And Giyuu trained Tanjiro between his missions. He told him about the concept of Sagoku, if he wanted to become his after passing the final exam. The mere idea of Tanjiro as a participant made him nauseous. "Do you really think I'm up to it, Tomioka-san?" "Yes, Tanjiro, even on the day I met you." Thorny topic for Giyuu, but Tanjiro remembered with sadness and acrid happiness for having met the other. "I saw your potential. If you wish to become my Sagoku, I will be more than happy to be your teacher." "You already are my teacher, Tomioka-san." He spoke with a smile, both aware that the gentle familiarity that he had developed after almost a year between them was different from a cold teacher-student relationship. Giyuu didn't want to compare it to the relationship he had with Orokodaki, and that the figure of Tanjiro was putting back on its feet, because for him the old man had been a teacher and a father, calling him that on those rare occasions that they both kept precious memories. And seeing Tanjiro so attached to him was nothing but counterproductive, considering his death was getting closer and closer. Not that the idea was all that realistic. "It will be much more official, Tanjiro, and it will be expected of you to take the role of Hashira upon my death, and considering our task it may be at the most unexpected time." And it really was a reality that Giyuu had implanted in his head when he was only 15, so that every time he was assigned to a more risky mission than the previous one, he faced it ready, but with a peaceful heart, because his death would count for little compared to that of a demon. "I'd rather prefer you live as much as possible." Tanjiro smiled, now watching the sun disappear behind the distant mountains above the huge boulder they were sitting on. The sun completely illuminated his face, and once again Giyuu had the honor of being in the presence of someone so enlightened. Only after years would he have been able to understand that he too was enlightened in the same way. He smiled, but lacked the usual peaceful happiness, almost a prayer in his rosy eyes wide open to register every inch of his usual stoic face. Only after years would he have realized that if he saw Tanjiro as the light, Giyuu was becoming his son. They said nothing more. The pillars of the demon hunter's body were intimidating, even to him as one of them. And he had kept hidden, for obvious reasons, considering how everyone seemed to hate him for some unknown reason. He didn't care so much about pointing out how scary they were sometimes. Perhaps they found him unpleasant for all those times they had spoken to him. For not even hearing an answer from Tomioka, lost in thinking about something that only he knew, his eyes glassy and absent, not even the slightest attention on his colleagues. Not that Giyuu remembered that. 'Cause all of them were extremely strong, and he genuinely respected them. But in that moment, he failed to find them interesting, or impressive, or admirable examples, or intimidating, or frightening, because lying there in front of them was Tanjiro, his uniform blood-stained and his body left to itself like a show put on just for them. And he had to refrain from yelling at anyone who hadn't first thought of doing something about the wounds a lower moon had inflicted on a damn Mizunoto. He had also had to refrain from killing himself with his own sword right there, at that precise moment, because if only he had succeeded to convince Tanjiro to immediately start training as a Sugoku rather than fend for himself a while, then Tanjiro would have known how to face the lower moon better. Nezuko was gone, and Tanjiro was coming to his senses, and everyone knew that Giyuu had gone against Kocho to prevent him from killing the two. Everyone knew, no one could explain why, and Tanjiro had awakened. Just the desperate tone Tanjiro had called Nezuko with made Giyuu shiver, and he didn't register exactly what had been said, not even when everyone started looking at him and named him. He only woke up to his name being said by that voice. "Giyuu-san!" And the tone was relieved, but scared, and Giyuu ignored their surprise. "Keep calm, Tanjiro. Ubuyashiki-sama will be here shortly. We will discuss the situation with him, and he will understand. I have everything under control." "I'm fine, Tanjiro. You're bleeding, and you're obviously not well." And he was really bleeding, but simply a cut along his side wasn't going to kill him by itself. But he had returned to Mount Sagiri after 3 weeks away, and Tanjiro was worrying too much. "Tanjiro, don't worry so much. It will barely leave a scar. Tanjiro, my life isn't in danger. He was just a lower moon that managed to wound me before I killed him because I was distracted. He was nowhere near killing me. Would you feel safer wrapping me yourself?" Tanjiro had watery eyes, and he looked at him with pursed lips as if he didn't want to cry. And Tomioka understood this well. Even he had reacted this way to Orokodaki's first wounds, unaccustomed as he was to that life, and afraid to lose the only person that cared about him. "I don't know how to do that, Giyuu-san, except for much smaller things." "I'll teach you. Let's go inside. Don't cry." And it was the right thing to say, because Tanjiro seemed to relax slightly, a grimace of pain present on his face, and now sitting as far as his hands tied behind his back would allow. But it wasn't for the other Hashiras, which now raised even more protests. "Nee, Tomioka-san, who's the boy you say you can help? Do you know him, or do you know even the demon he brings around as a harmless pet?" "We'll figure it out soon, Shinobu, if this bastard knows what he's talking about." He has never seen anything wrong with Shinagawa's anger, because he was one of his strongest colleagues, and Giyuu had a deep respect for him, even though the other had hated him even more than the others apparently. And Shinagawa, the Shinagawa who had disrespected Oyakata-sama himself once, the Shinagawa who respected no one but Oyakata-sama and Giyomi, and Shinasugawa, who always found a good ally in violence, had Nezuko's box in his hands. And suddenly, his words didn't count for anything, because Tanjiro seemed to shiver again and lean towards Shinasugawa. "When I heard a demonslayer was hanging out with an actual demon, I didn't believe it, but apparently it's true. Do you have anything to say, Tomioka? Or we aren't important enough for you?" And something he would never understand about Shinasugawa was his constant accusations regarding an apparent superiority of Giyuu himself. "Wait for Oyakata-sama, Shinasugawa. Do you think I'd be here if it weren't for Ubuyashiki-sama not feeling it was a risk?" "I want to talk to the kid, you bastard. You know what hit him hard enough in the head to convince him it was a good idea to do something like this?" "The boy's injured by a fight with a lower moon, beyond his reach. He has only been a hunter for a few months. He cannot speak in this state." Mitsuri realizes that she had never heard Tomioka talk so much, and apparently it was to defend a boy who called him by his name. No one had ever called Tomioka giyuu other than Oyakata-sama. Shinasugawa brought his hand up to his sword. "You're so eager to talk. Why don't you do it instead of the brat? You seem to know him well." The tension was palpable in the air, and Giyuu found himself bringing his hand closer to his sword. "Don't touch the boy, Shinasugawa." And the stoic, silent, antisocial Tomioka Giyuu, to whom none of them had ever spoken more than 3 words in a row, now openly challenged Shinasugawa, his eyes cold but never like before. "No one mentioned the boy, you bastard." And in a second, the sword had sunk into the box. A stifled scream came out and blood poured out of the fabric that was slowly soaking. "Shinasugawa, Oyakata, you!" And Tanjiro was standing, taking a run and jumping, and Giyuu heard his own voice yelling something, but the only thing that rang out was the crash of Tanjiro's skull against Shinasugawa's forehead. Who collapsed on the ground, the box abandoned, and hot blood pouring out of his nose without control. And Giyuu thanked the gods for the arrival of Ubuyashiki Kagaya, because otherwise he would have done something he would have regretted, or maybe not. The case of the Kamado brothers is complex, and the head of the family's voice reassured him, just a little, because Giyuu hoped that he would at least listen. "Sorry, Oyakata-sama, but I'm of the opinion, and I'm not the only one, that disciplinary sanction should be applied to Tomioka. He attacked a member of the Demonslayer Corps to defend a demon and his protector, failing at the task of him as a Hashira. Tomioka Giyuu's actions are understandable, because Kamado Tanjiro has been designated as a Sokoku for years. And this no one knew, and they remembered that letter that had come to them months and months before during a meeting of the Pillars, and Oyakata-sama's words about a student. No harm will be inflicted on Kamado Tanjiro as a promising member of our ranks, and Sogoku of one of our most competent colleagues. And the demon? Shinasugawa was visibly not happy with the situation, but he still had Nezuko's box. Orokodaki had put he and Giyuu's life on the line, though Giyuu wasn't surprised or bothered. He found himself thinking that he wouldn't be so against the idea of dying in the event of the Kamado siblings' deaths. He didn't stay too long to think about it. But now Shinasugawa filled the air with the sweet smell of blood, different for anyone who sensed him, and demons specifically. Blood pouring over Nezuko's trembling body. Nezuko was awake, and finally Giyuu spoke to her for the first time. He hadn't had time to actually do it, because Tanjiro had explained who Giyuu was, drawing him better than he was in his opinion. The idea that this is how Tanjiro saw him made him feel happy, but like an imposter all the same. And Nezuko hugged him around the waist with the slender arms of her child form, rubbing her face in his dark uniform, muttering incomprehensible words and squeezing him again and again, but without hurting him. Giyuu cried a little, but Tanjiro didn't notice, or at least he hoped so. Nezuko was looking at Shinasugawa with wide, inhuman eyes, drool dribbling from her mouth and bamboo muzzle, and Giyuu hoped that she would have been able to resist. And he succeeded, and Oyakata-sama decreed that Nezuko Kamado's life shouldn't be taken from her. "Oyakata-sama, if you will." "No problem, my child. We can postpone our meeting a little, but I'm sure you have a lot to tell us." From where he had forced Obanai, To release Tanjiro, he walked towards the boy, ignoring the others present and Kocho's amused smile. That was, as always, the only one having fun. Be quiet, Tanjiro. You're injured. The pressure on your lungs hasn't done you any good, and you need medical attention, and your sister needs rest. Let's go. Tanjiro stands still. Giyuu-san, I'm fine, don't worry. You'll be able to say that when your wrist isn't sprained and you're not training injured. He was quick to sling him over his shoulders, arms wrapped around his neck and legs around his waist, and shot a confused look back at Mitsuri from where she was blushing and looking at him, shaking her head and muttering something in an excited voice. He was quick to make his way to the box, passing Shinosugawa, who stared at him with iron eyes, without sympathy and only anger. He found himself not caring at all. Nezuko raised her head from where she had retreated, back in the body of a 10-year-old child, her pink eyes looking curiously at the pillars, but she stopped them on Tomioka and let out a short sound of happiness, rubbing her head against the hand that the man had placed on her hair. Nezuko, I need you to go back in so I can take you to a safe place. Can you do it for me? The siblings secured, Tanjiro now almost unconscious, he began to walk towards the butterfly estate. Tomioka-san, did we just need you to adopt a demon and a kid to get the slightest reaction from you? Kocho was certainly amused, and they looked at her tensely. I didn't adopt anyone, Kocho. It doesn't matter how much respect I have for each of you. Try that again, and I won't worry about the rules of the Corps. And he turned away, leaving them behind, because he didn't want to deal with them right now. He just wanted to rest and make sure Tanjiro and Nezuko were okay.